Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Relationship and Truth. And yes, I do plan on getting back to some of the video series that I have started, including the Van Bruggen response. Still in the works, still working on that. Just takes me forever, I'm sorry about that. But in the meantime, I have what will hopefully be a relatively short video, guys, on the concept of real loss or injury. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that when you look through a lot of God's law, there's a lot of it that does ask people to take preventative measures and things like that. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately, just in the American system of law that we have now. There are a lot of preventative measures that are becoming law and basically being forced on people as law. You have things like, now you have to wear your seatbelt. It's a part of the law. And in some jurisdictions, as far as I understand it, cops can actually pull you over for not wearing a seatbelt. In my home state, as I understand it, it's a part of the law, but they can only cite you for it if they pull you over for something else as well. But as I understand, in some jurisdictions, that's not the case. If they simply see you driving without a seatbelt on, they can pull you over for that and ticket you for that. So there's lots of preventative measures that are being built into the American system of law. And for those of you who don't know, I am indeed a proponent of the Second Amendment, and there's lots of laws that have been put on the books recently and are being put on the books even as we speak that are meant as preventative measures. And people are, of course, being punished who don't comply with these preventative measures. And that has me greatly concerned. And it has me greatly concerned because when I look at God's law, which I as a Reformed Christian believe should be the basis for all human law, I don't see good justification for punishing people when there is no real loss or injury. I'm not saying felt loss or injury. Oh, he hurt my feelings. That's worth at least $2 billion right there. Take away his job, take away everything he has because he hurt my feelings. No, real loss or injury. Okay, you are really hurt, somebody died, you really lost money, you really lost possessions, real loss or injury. When I look through the biblical code, that's where I see punishments being applied. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. Let's go to Deuteronomy 22, verse 8. This is, of course, a part of a longer list of various laws that are given in God's law. And a lot of God's law is given in the terms of case law. That is, if this happens, do this. Or this did happen and we did this. It gives examples. And the way that Christians have historically understood that is that what God is doing is He's giving us real-world examples, and we are to take the principles from those and apply those principles broadly across the spectrum. And this has become a foundation of Western law to a great extent. Sadly, in the modern, we've greatly perverted it, but for a long time, Western law was built on the principle of principle. That is, laws are put in place and you're to interpret them according to them to their original intent, and based on their original intent, then apply it to other cases that may come up accordingly. So in Deuteronomy 22:8, we're going to have the idea of preventative measures come into place regarding construction. And let's go ahead and take a look at that. So Deuteronomy 22:8, it says, "When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof, that you may not bring the guilt of blood upon your house, if anyone should fall from it." Good preventative measure. And just so you guys know, for those of you who might not know, at that time and place in history, the houses that they would make would usually have flat roofs. And of course, this is well before the days of air conditioning and things like that. And so a lot of times it was actually a lot more comfortable to be on the roof of the house than it would be to be inside the house. Inside the house was usually kind of cramped and dark, and it's a place to sleep and that's about it. Not overly comfortable a lot of times. But the roof of the house would be nice and flat, and you get the cool breeze going by at least, and those kinds of things. You could at least breathe and all that kind of stuff was sometimes a lot more comfortable. So people would spend a lot more time on the roof of their houses than certainly we do. And since they're flat, you can do that. And so the law that's being given here in Deuteronomy says, well, The fact that it's up on the roof is a little bit of a liability. If people fall off, they could get hurt or die. And you don't want that to happen, so build a parapet around your roof, basically a railing. Fence in your roof so that people can't fall off of it accidentally. But what I find about this that's interesting, and this is something that in and of itself you could see being done in America quite well, building codes. If you're going to build such and such a house, it has to be built in such and such a way. But what I find interesting about this is that where the guilt is applied. Does this say that if you fail to build a parapet on your roof, that you're then guilty? No. It says that you would bring guilt upon your house if anyone should fall from it. That's where the guilt is applied, where there's actually a real loss or injury. So what this means is that in this case, if somebody didn't want to build a parapet on their roof, fine, but they accept the guilt for that. That means that if someone goes up on the roof and dies as a result of it falling off, they're the ones who are responsible for their death, and they can be held accountable as a de facto murderer. So imagine someone with limited funds who might not have the resources to build the parapets on the roof. What could they do? Well, they could simply not invite anyone over. And if they never went on the roof themselves and they didn't allow anyone else to go up on the roof, problem solved. There's no real loss or injury. What does it matter? Now, if that happened in modern America, they would say, well, you need to have it on there. Even if you never use it and you never allow someone to use it, you have to have it on there. You have to build it, and you have to pay for the licensing fee, and you have to pay for the special contractor who has his special licensing fee, and on and on and on it goes. I don't find that being considered something that would be just in the biblical system. The biblical system says that if you fail to take preventative measures, this seems to be the principle thereof, that you are responsible for whatever would follow from failing to take preventative measures. But failing to take the preventative measures in and of themselves does not incur guilt. It's what follows from that, which may or may not happen, that incurs the guilt. Here's another example of what I mean. Let's go to Exodus 21. Exodus 21, and it's pretty far down in the chapter. Let me see here. Nope. Verse 28. Starting in verse 28, it says, when an ox gores a man or a woman to death, the ox shall be stoned, and its flesh shall not be eaten, but the owner of the ox shall not be liable. But if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has been warned but not kept it in, and it kills a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. If a ransom is imposed on him, then he shall give for the redemption of his life whatever is imposed on him. If it gores a man's son or daughter, he shall be dealt with according to this same rule. If the ox gores a slave, male or female, the owner shall give their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Right, this one is a little bit longer, and so there's a little bit more meat for us to dig into. But the basic principle that I'm getting at here is that, okay, here is a case where there's a known danger. If it's an unknown danger, notice that the person isn't liable. It's not automatically assumed that since this is an ox, it must automatically have the habit of goring. That's not assumed. By the way, when it comes to gun safety laws, preventative measures there, that would be nice if that principle applied there, that you don't automatically assume that just because something is capable of doing damage, that automatically will. So you don't assume that just because it's a gun, so it's just suddenly going to go off and hurt someone. Oh, you have a gun that's out and it's not locked up. Well, that's obviously a safety hazard and someone could die. Not necessarily, not any more than having an ox that's around the house could cause someone to die. Technically, yes, an ox is capable of killing someone, but that doesn't mean that every ox has that tendency. And the same thing with guns. There's lots of guns that are very safe. And as long as the people who are around them using them are safe, there's not going to be any major problems. Now, if you have a gun that maybe is an older gun or something like that, because there are some older guns that are not overly safe, and some designs that are not overly safe. And if you know that it's a particular model or a particular design that is not overly safe and you don't take due precautions, then yes, that's a problem. But the mere potential for injury is not sufficient to accuse someone of wrongdoing. And again, you'll notice in this law, when it gives the various conditions here, it's if the ox actually does something. Okay, so it's shown to have a tendency, it's accustomed to do this thing. Okay, so the tendency has been established that requires some kind of a preventative measure, or would at least say that a preventative measure would be wise. And if you fail to be wise and it results in a real loss or injury, then you're liable, then you're guilty, then the punishments can be applied to you. But just because you have something that technically is capable of doing damage but has not shown any tendency thus far, that doesn't make you guilty. And even if you have something that has shown a tendency, but nothing happens, so you have a gun that's a bit unsafe, but you're the only one in your house and you know how it works and you know what the conditions are and you just simply never let anyone else mess with it, what's the problem? Okay, so having something that is potentially dangerous is not wrongdoing, and having something that has an established tendency towards wrongdoing of one kind or another that is established to be dangerous, not potentially dangerous, but is in fact dangerous, but nothing happens as a result of it, still there is no guilt. In the biblical system, as far as I can determine, guilt occurs when there is real loss or injury. Potential loss is potential loss or injury, or felt loss or injury in the modern paradigm, is not enough biblically to constitute the imputation of guilt in civil cases. It is not. Now, conscience-wise, yes, put a parapet around your house. Conscience-wise, yes, lock up the ox. Conscience-wise, it's probably not a good idea to leave a bunch of loaded guns all over your house. If you have a loaded gun in your house, it should probably be accessible only to key people that you can be known and trusted, and you should probably not have guns around the house that are prone to malfunctioning, and especially ones that are prone to dangerous kinds of malfunctioning, so on and so forth. But biblically speaking, I do not find a basis for saying that just simply because preventative measures have not been taken, either completely peremptorily, oh, there's the mere potential of danger here, so we have to fix it, or even if there is an established tendency, failing to take it, where failure at either of those points actually constitutes the imputation of guilt in any kind of a case of civil law. If there is no real loss or injury in the biblical system, there is no imputation of guilt. I can't find it. And these two cases that I've brought forward here, these two elements of case law, these two, okay, if this happens, do this, the principles derived from them would say that it is on the basis of real loss or injury that you can then impute guilt. Okay, so something happened. Who is responsible? They're responsible by way of negligence. They're responsible by way of failing to take preventative measures when there was established tendency, not just mere potential, but established tendency. That makes them guilty up to blood guilt, up to the punishment including execution. Now, this is kind of a side note, but it is interesting here that yes, the owner can be put to death, but it is also given that ransom can be applied, and that in the case of slaves, the ransom amount is basically set to 30 shekels of silver. And there's lots of actually interesting things that would go on there, and I don't want to get into a huge long topic because a lot of people don't understand the biblical system of slavery. This could almost be an entirely different video in and of itself. maybe I'll leave that one as a vote. Do you guys want me to comment on verse 32 where it talks about goring a slave and the owner being made to pay 30 shekels for it or not? I'll leave that one up to you guys. But what I do want to point out is that contrary to a lot of people's opinion of the Old Testament actually offers a lot more grace in its system of law than a lot of people realize. Yes, a lot of the crimes in the Old Testament were punishable up to death. However, this caveat that's made explicit in this particular law seems to be implicit in a lot of the other ones, that the death penalty is the maximum sentence that can be applied, but that doesn't mean that lesser sentences can't be. And in the Old Testament system of law, it would usually be the elders of the community that would come together and decide a matter. They basically acted like a group of judges that would come together and render a verdict. And they would have the option of determining the sentence. And of course, God's law stipulated which crimes could be punishable by death and which ones couldn't be. But there is the implicit case here that at least with certain laws that could involve a death penalty, they could impose lesser laws. And you look at other places in the Bible, and it seems like when lesser sentences were handed out, it was usually done with the consultation of the victim's family. That is, if the victim's family was okay with this person going free, then a lot of times you'd have a lesser punishment instilled, and it would be to the benefit of the victim's family. So the ox gets out, it gores a man. His family is now put at quite an imposition because not only have they lost a fellow human being, a father, a brother, a husband, so on and so forth, they've also lost a provider. And so when it says if a ransom is imposed on him, on the owner of this ox that gored this man to death, assuming that the owner had known that the ox had this tendency, there's not only potential, but there's actually tendency involved, then a ransom could be imposed on him. And it would basically be a way for him to, in some sense, make it up to the family. Not that you could ever replace the life, but at least provide for the family. Okay, so they're going to be less a provider. You can give them a sum of money that would help compensate them for this loss of provision. That would be one way of getting out of it, but like I said, you read through the Old Testament law, that's usually at the discretion of the elders and the family and the victims. But the Old Testament was not always automatically death penalty for everything. There was a lot of grace that was involved, and a lot of people don't understand that. Just because death was the maximum penalty that was imposed for a lot of Old Testament crimes, that doesn't mean that it was always used. I guarantee you that there were a lot more people who in the Old Testament who were guilty of crimes that were punishable by death who did not receive the death penalty. Guarantee it. And that became a model for Western law. Now, granted, in the modern it's been greatly perverted, but in Western law we have a sentencing system that involves maximum sentences and minimum sentences. And we leave it in the discretion of the judge, usually taking into account how this is going to affect the victims, so on and so forth, to decide where this particular perpetrator should be on that spectrum. And that goes into other topics that I've talked about. As someone who would say that God's law should be the basis for man's law, I agree with God's law in saying that the maximum penalty for acts of homosexuality should be the death sentence. But also being someone who would use God's law as the model for man's law, that would be the maximum sentence. In a lot of cases, you have an implicit gradation here. In some cases, Might that be a good maximum sentence? Yes. In cases where homosexuality also involves pedophilia, I would argue that, yeah, the death penalty would be more than appropriate. Okay, because that is at least statutory rape, if nothing else. And in the Bible, rape is definitely a death-worthy crime. But like I said, leaving it up to the judges, if you have godly judges who take these things into account accordingly, you're dealing with someone who has committed acts of homosexuality in the past, realize that they're wrong and are penitent. Yes, the judge still needs to hold up justice in the land in the sense of saying that homosexuality is wrong, but doesn't necessarily need to be the death penalty in those cases, especially when you have penitent people. No. And I think you can make a good argument from the Bible that that kind of leniency is allowable. Now, some people who are listening to this are going to, how dare you suggest that homosexuality be a crime at all? Well, in the Bible, it is a crime. Okay, I'm a biblical Christian. That's the way that is. Okay, you're not going to change the Bible. That's what it says. Homosexuality is a crime punishable by up to death. But what I'm trying to do is remind people who, like me, believe that homosexuality is a sin and a crime, that there is grace in God's system, and even grace in the Old Testament system that allows for a gradation of sentences, as you can see here. But getting around back to the main point was that guilt is not applied unless there is actually real loss or injury. In the case of the parapets around the roof, the railing around the roof to keep people from falling over, if you were to not build a parapet around your house, but no one ever went off on the roof so they could never fall off of it, it would be a null issue, as far as I can tell from the plain reading of the text. And the case here with the ox. Okay, you have an ox. In and of itself, yes, there's potential for danger there, because ox is a big, powerful, and potentially dangerous animal, but the potential in and of itself is not enough to warrant anything. Okay, if you have an ox that does have an established tendency to gore, yes, that is a problem, but it only results in an imputation of guilt if something actually happens, if there's actually real loss or injury as a result of this ox goring someone. Okay, it's only if it results in a problem. Circling back around to the issue of seatbelts that I talked about. I believe I talked about it in this one. I've redone this video a few times just because I wanted to get all this stuff in. But if not, seatbelts are an interesting case in modern America because it's a preventative measure that's enforceable by law. And from what I understand, like I said, in some jurisdictions, the cops can pull you over if they simply see that you're not wearing a seatbelt while driving. That would not fly in the biblical system. The biblical system requires real loss or injury. So, in the biblical system, the only way you could get in trouble for not wearing your seatbelt is if you actually got in a car accident in which wearing the seatbelt would be relevant. Of course, at that point, if it's just yourself and you get in a car accident and you're not wearing your seatbelt and you get thrown through the windshield and die, seems like that would be a rather dumb thing to bring up at that point. You know, after he's been dead and buried, we can put a little placard on his tombstone. Did not wear his seatbelt, fined $500. Okay. Now, in the case of, say, parents not buckling in their children in the back seat, and there's some kind of an accident that happens and one of the children goes flying through the windshield and dies, then yes, they're responsible for their kid's death and should be punished for such. But if nothing happens, why are we running around chasing people down? I see great problems with that. If people want to assume the risk and the punishments that come with it, why are we going around forcing people to adhere to certain standards? This also, as I think I briefly mentioned, also applies to things like building codes and whatnot. I can understand, letting it be that, insurance companies won't insure a house unless it's built a certain way. I get that. If an insurance company is a private company, and as long as it's not forced on anyone that they have to have insurance, if they want to go out and build a house from scratch, they should be allowed to. And if it's built from scratch, it's probably not going to be according to code. But as long as they're willing to assume the risk and understand that if anything happens, they're the ones who are liable, I don't see any reason to make a big stink about it. If something happens, they should be held accountable for whatever work they did or did not do, in the case of railings and stuff like that. But if it's the case of they just want to go and find a place to live and be off by themselves, or just them and their family, and only assume risk for their family and so on and so forth, let them. I don't see where it's the government's job to go around trying to keep everybody safe. I do see where biblically it's the government's job to dispense justice when something has happened, when there is a real loss or injury. But biblically, I cannot find a good basis for the government's job to be going around ensuring the safety of every individual. The Bible tends to favor personal liberty and freedom over safety. It does. It just simply does. And a lot of times historically, that's what we've seen, is that if there's a great emphasis on the safety and security of the people, there's going to be an implicit loss of freedom that happens. And the Bible always tends towards the side of freedom. Now, it does hold people responsible for the stupid things they do when it results in real loss or injury, but not before. And I think that America could take some pointers from the Bible in this regard. It used to be the case in the West in general that laws were written and then they were interpreted on the basis of their original intent. And especially in America, they were interpreted and written with an eye to freedom. What would this do to people's freedoms if we were to put this law in place? But lately we've been seeing a switch from what does this do to people's freedom to how does this promote people's safety and security? And those two things often conflict with each other. A society can be free or a society can be secure, but it usually cannot be both. And the author of the Bible, ultimately God, knew that. He knew how men worked. And what he promoted, what his prescriptive will for people seems to be, is that they would promote freedom rather than security. Let God be your security and promote freedom for your brother. That is the responsibility of government, is to ensure people's freedoms and to promote justice when something actually happens. There's been real loss or injury. It is not the government's job to make you safe. It is not the government's job to make you feel secure. It's not the government's job to make sure that every mouth is fed. It's not the government's job to make sure that everyone is healthy. It's not the government's job to make sure that everyone is safe. But when injustice is done, when there's a real loss or injury, it's the government's job to uphold the value of human life, the value of preventative measures and wisdom, so on and so forth, but not before, after there's been a real loss or injury. All right, those are my random thoughts for the night. Thank you very much for listening. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you would come to an understanding of the true Christ of history, the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.